The sun was beginning to sink below the horizon, painting the runway an ominous orange. Inside the plane, there was a tense silence, broken only by the occasional sigh and the nervous rustling of magazine pages. The passengers were waiting for takeoff, but instead of gaining altitude, the plane frowned in place. Strange conversations were going on in the cockpit, fragments of which reached the nearest rows through a poorly closed door. "This is not up to standard," the captain repeated, sounding as if he were insisting on a vital truth. A few minutes later, two stewards in somber uniforms walked down the aisle of the plane. They headed toward a woman sitting in the middle of the cabin. She was dressed simply, a bright scarf, jeans, a comfortable blouse. In her hands was a book, The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue. Her face expressed complete bewilderment. "Madam," said one of the stewards, stopping in front of her seat, "we must ask you to leave the plane." There were indignant cries in the cabin. People began to look around, realizing that something had gone wrong. "Excuse me, what is it?" The woman raised her head, her voice sounding firm, although there was anger in her eyes. "I have a ticket. Everything is paid for. I am not bothering anyone." "Excuse me, madam, but you have violated security protocol," said the second steward, although his look was slightly confused. "What protocol?" Her voice wavered. "What did I do?" The pilot emerged from the cockpit, his face red with tension. He raised his hand as if trying to call for silence. "We can't take off," he said, looking straight at the woman, "because your scarf, it ruins the color harmony in the cabin." The salon exploded with a chorus of puzzled exclamations. "Excuse me, what?" the woman cried, her voice filled with indignation. "My scarf." "Yes, madam," the pilot confirmed, his voice turning icy. "We have to maintain a certain atmosphere in the cabin. The red scarf is distracting and creates a visual imbalance." People started shouting questions. Someone raised a phone to film what was happening, but the pilot did not flinch. The woman stood up, her face expressing a mixture of rage and despair. "Are you serious? You want to throw me off the plane because of my headscarf, or is it because I—" She didn't finish. The atmosphere in the cabin became heavy, as if the air was filled with a silent understanding. The pilot had his hands on his hips, as if preparing for a fight. He looked down at the woman, his posture projecting superiority. His eyes were a mixture of irritation and something darker, a cold contempt that only heightened the tension. "Madam," he said, as if explaining the obvious, "you don't understand. This is not just a handkerchief. This is a question of standards. Our airline has strict requirements for harmony and style. If you are unable to follow these rules, it is your responsibility." The woman took a step back, but her gaze remained firm. "Are you saying that my headscarf violates your standard?" She emphasized the last word, looking at the pilot as if she could see right through him. "Or is it because I violate your norm?" There was no anger in her voice, only an icy calm that cut through the air like a blade. The passengers watching the scene exchanged glances, but no one dared to intervene. The pilot leaned closer, his face tightening. "Don't be dramatic," he hissed, so quietly only she could hear. "What you don't understand is that your color, it stands out. It distracts passengers. We want people to feel comfortable, and you're difficult." Her eyebrows shot up. She couldn't believe her ears. "My color," she repeated, her voice growing louder. "Seriously, are you now claiming that my skin is an annoyance to your passengers?" "No need to distort things," the pilot retorted, clearly unaccustomed to resistance. "But you yourself must understand that there are certain rules in society, and sometimes some things are better left unemphasized. Some things—" Her voice shook, not from fear, but from the rage that was building inside her. "Are you seriously telling me that I shouldn't exist in this space because my skin color bothers you?" "Madam, don't get personal," he cut her off, his tone hard. "We follow standards. If those standards don't suit you, you can choose another airline. We don't have to please everyone." The passengers began to talk, the whispers growing louder. Some raised their phones, recording what was happening. Off to the side, a woman with a small child looked indignant. "This is madness," someone muttered. "How is this even possible?" The woman took a deep breath, trying to contain her emotions. Her voice became cold and calculating again. "You think you have the right to decide who meets your standards. You have no idea how far this story will go. People will find out that your airline rejects people because of their skin color. Let's see how long you can please your passengers." The pilot straightened up, but his face turned crimson. He felt control slipping away, but he was not going to back down. "It is your right, madam, but now you will leave this plane. Your very position causes a conflict. Safety on board is more important to us than your opinion." With these words, he motioned to two security officers, who were already standing at the entrance to the salon. The woman looked at them, then glanced around at the passengers, expecting someone to stand up and support her, but everyone just silently looked away. The woman stood in the middle of the narrow passage, like a stone surrounded by a turbulent stream of indifference. Her breathing quickened, but her voice remained firm. "You can take me off the plane," she said, looking the pilot straight in the eye, "but you can't make me feel guilty for who I am." But her words seemed to bounce off him as if they were a wall. The pilot gave a short, unpleasant laugh. Oh, come on. I'm here to ensure the safety and comfort of all passengers, not to satisfy your whims." Before the woman could answer, one of the security officers approached her. His face was cold and indifferent. "You either leave the plane voluntarily, or we will remove you by force," he said dryly, as if it were a question about a forgotten bag. "By force?" She narrowed her eyes, trying to comprehend what was happening. "You want to use force because of what? Because of the scarf, or because of my skin? Speak frankly." "Nobody said anything about your skin," the pilot interjected, falsely defensive. "But if it comes down to it, madam, we all understand that sometimes people don't feed into the overall picture. It's not personal, it's just inconvenient." The words, spoken in a deliberately indifferent tone, hit harder than the scream. She felt her knees almost buckle, but she straightened up. "That's not true. It's completely personal," she replied. "Are you telling me that I'm inconvenient?" "Inconvenient for whom?" "For people who are afraid to see someone who's not like them." At this point, several passengers began to talk nervously. Someone was whispering support for her, but the loudest voices were those who were rushing things. "Let her be taken out already. We're wasting time," a man from the middle of the row exclaimed. "Yes, everyone pay for the tickets. It's disgusting, but we have to fly," the woman with the child confirmed, looking at her watch. The woman with the headscarf glanced around the salon. Her eyes landed on each person, their downcast faces, their fingers nervously fingering their phones. She looked for at least one pair of eyes full of determination, but she found only fear, indifference, or hidden hostility. "I see," she finally said quietly. Her voice shook, but she quickly regained her composure. "You all choose to look the other way because it doesn't concern you. The one day it will concern everyone." "Let's get this over with," the pilot said, his patience wearing thin. "We can't let one person sabotage the entire flight." "A person?" she asked again. "You don't see me as a person. To you, I'm just a nuisance." The security officers grabbed her by the arms. She did not resist, but continued to speak, her voice becoming louder. "You are all taught to be blind," she said, her voice carrying throughout the salon. "Blind to injustice, to pain, to humiliation. But I will not go in silence. I will not be part of your silence." She was escorted off the plane, to the approving glances of some passengers and the shamefaced silence of others. Only when she had disappeared through the door did the pilot, satisfied, return to the cockpit. Finally, he muttered, sitting down in his seat, "Now we can fly in peace." But outside the window, on the empty runway, stood a woman with a bright headscarf. Her face expressed more than resentment, it expressed determination. And that look, like a burning fire, stayed with the passengers even after takeoff. The plane finally took off, but the atmosphere inside was far from calm. The passengers tried to act as if nothing had happened, but the whispers continued to run through the rows like an electric shock. Some were reviewing videos they had filmed, some were nervously searching for news on their phones, and some were trying to pretend to read a magazine, but could not hide the trembling in their hands. There was a tense silence in the cockpit. The co-pilot, a young man with a tired face, cast wary glances at the captain. "Are you sure it was right?" he asked quietly, finally breaking the silence. "Of course," the captain replied coldly, not taking his eyes off the instrument panel. "We maintain order. It was necessary." "But you know the passengers were recording everything on video," the co-pilot continued. "Did you hear what she said? It looks. Let them do what they want," the captain snapped, his voice sharp. "You think I'm afraid someone will call me a racist? It's just standard. No one wants to make a big deal out of it. But his words sounded uncertain. He clearly knew that the videos had already begun to spread, and with each viewing his face became more and more recognizable. Meanwhile, in the cabin, the passengers began to talk louder. A young girl in a hawada stood up from her seat, turned to the others, and spoke in a loud voice. "We all saw what happened," she said, her voice firm. "It was disgusting. He threw her off the plane just because she was black. You all know that?" Several people stirred, unsure of how to react. Someone tried to pull her up. "Girl, it's none of our business. We just want to get to the place." But she didn't calm down. "This is our business. If we let this go, if we just keep quiet, we become complicit. No one has the right to treat a person the way they treated her." Gradually others began to join her. A young man sitting next to her stood up and said, "She's right. We've all seen it. And if we remain silent, it means we agree." There was a real stir in the cabin. People stood up from their seats, expressed their opinions. Someone started banging on the partitions, demanding that the pilot come out and explain himself. "Let him come out," the middle-aged man shouted. "We want to know why he thought this was okay." Meanwhile, the pilot heard noise from the cockpit and began fidgeting nervously. He put on his headphones to try to ignore the growing chaos. "They'll never calm down," the co-pilot muttered, looking at him. "This could get out of hand. They're passengers. They have nothing to decide. We'll get them to their destination and everything will settle down." The captain answered confidently, although his fingers trembled as he checked the flight data again. But the plane, or perhaps fate itself, decided otherwise. A few minutes after takeoff, one of the passengers sitting by the window noticed a strange flickering on one of the engines. "What is this?" he asked loudly, pointing. "There's something wrong there." His words caused even more panic. People started screaming, looking out the windows, demanding that the pilot do something. However, the captain did not react, trying to concentrate on the controls. Then there was a loud roar and the plane jerked violently. People screamed. Masks fell from the ceilings. Alarms filled the cabin. "This is all your fault," a woman in the front row suddenly shouted, pointing through the door at the pilot. "You caused this scandal, and now we're all paying the price." Each word struck the captain like a hammer blow. His face turned ashen. He tried to calm himself, but the noise outside and inside the plane grew louder. At that moment, a voice from the speaker filled the cabin. "This is the pilot. Please remain seated. We are handling this situation." But people no longer believed him. In the eyes of the passengers, he became a symbol of injustice and threat, and the engine continued to make strange sounds, filling everyone with fear for their lives. The tragedy that began with one scarf was gaining momentum, threatening to become something much bigger. As the plane began to shake, as if protesting the decisions that had been made on board, the passengers frowned, cowering in their seats. The engine noise, a roar, and the panic cries only added to the atmosphere of despair. The pilot, suppressing his inner anxiety, repeated mechanical phrases over the loudspeaker, urging everyone to remain calm. But even he knew that control was slipping away like sand through his fingers. On the ground, in the airline office, the situation was quite different. The flight director, a man with an arrogant expression and a shaved chin, was watching a video screen of a woman with a headscarf leaving the plane. He grinned, leaning back in his leather chair. "What a circus," he muttered, adjusting the cuffs of his perfectly pressed jacket. Another one who decided to put on a show. His deputy, a young man with an uncertain look, stood nearby. "But, sir, there is already a buzz on the internet. The videos are spreading by the hour. Maybe we should do something. Apologize. Make a statement." "Apologize," the manager interrupted, laughing. "For what?" "For following standards. This woman is to blame herself. She knew where she Saturday. If her presence caused discomfort, that's her problem. We are responsible for the company's reputation, not her feelings." The deputy coughed awkwardly, trying to find the right words, but he was interrupted by phone calls and notifications that kept coming into the control panel. Questions from journalists, requests from outraged users, and even demands for an investigation were flying in from all sides. But the manager remained unperturbed. "Just send a standard response," he said over his shoulder. "That we can't comment on individual cases, but our company values the comfort of all passengers. And don't forget to add something about our high safety standards. That always works." But he was wrong. As he gave his orders, A more emotional discussion was taking place in the next room. The woman who had been escorted off the plane Saturday in front of the airline representative. Another middle-aged man with a tired face. Her voice was shaky, but there was still strength in it. "Do you realize what you've done?" she asked, looking him straight in the eye. "You haven't just humiliated me. You've shown the world that my life is nothing but an inconvenience to you. Do you want to brush this aside? Do you think it will go away?" The representative sighed quietly, avoiding her gaze. "Madam, I understand your feelings, but this is a difficult situation. You must understand that we have rules. They are made for—" "For what?" she interrupted, her voice growing louder. "So that people like me can't feel comfortable, so that you can control us, humiliate us. You know it's racist, but you don't even try to hide it." He shifted nervously in his chair, but before he could answer, the manager entered the room. His cold face looked as if it had been carved from stone. He looked at her with contempt. "Are you still here?" he asked, not trying to hide his irritation. "I thought this issue had already been resolved." The woman slowly turned her head towards him, her eyes glowing like coals. "You think you can get rid of me that easily?" she asked, her voice like thunder. "You want me to disappear, for everyone to be quiet, but that won't happen." "Listen," he interrupted, his voice rough. "You need to understand one thing. You're a nobody, just a passenger playing the victim card. You broke the rules, and now you're trying to make racism out of it. It won't work." Her face remained expressionless, but she rose slowly, standing to her full height. "A nobody," she repeated, looking at him as if she could see right through him. "I'm human, and your unwillingness to admit it is the problem. But I won't remain silent. You and your company will remember this day." A manager snorted derisively, but his smoothness was beginning to crack. The noise outside the office was growing louder. People were gathering outside the building, demanding answers, chanting slogans against discrimination. The manager looked out the window, and his confidence began to fade. What is this?" he muttered, turning to his deputy. "It's a protest, sir," he replied, his voice sounding frightened. "The people are demanding your resignation." The manager turned to the woman, but she was gone. She was gone, leaving behind a heavy silence and anxiety that grew like a fire. The plane continued its journey through the dark night sky, but the tension among the passengers did not subside. People Saturday, as if on pins and needles, talking in whispers and stealthily looking out the windows. The airliner, which had been a symbol of comfort and speed, had now become a symbol of anxiety and injustice. The pilot, hearing that the passengers were again beginning to express their discontent, chuckled darkly. "People are always looking for something to complain about," he muttered, removing his headset and turning to his co-pilot. "Once we land, it'll all be forgotten. They'll take off their luggage, go home, and there won't be any scandal." But the co-pilot did not share his confidence. He glanced cautiously at the captain but said nothing, not wanting to stir up an argument. Down below, far below them, the lights of the city grew increasingly blurry, as if the skies themselves refused to bear witness to what was happening on board. Meanwhile, on the ground, tensions were running high. The protests outside the airline building were growing. People were holding signs that read, "We are all equal. Racism is unacceptable. And where's that justice?" The reporters' cameras captured every detail, every cry, every gesture. But inside the building, everything was different. The manager, sitting in his office, looked at the computer screens, his expression growing darker. "What are they trying to prove?" He threw at his deputy. "They are just a crowd. They shout, but in a week they will forget. We are a large corporation. They will not do anything to us." "But, sir," the deputy tried to object, his voice full of anxiety. "Some of our shareholders are already contacting us. They are worried. This could affect the company's reputation and even its shares." "Let them worry," the manager replied, rising from his chair. "I'll sort it out." He walked into the conference room to brief the press. His face was full of confidence, but inside he was beginning to feel a strange, almost inexplicable unease. Taking the microphone, he began his speech. "Our company has always put the safety and comfort of passengers first. The incident that occurred on the flight requires careful consideration. However, I want to emphasize our team followed the established protocols. We do not allow discrimination and always act in the interests of our clients." His voice was convincing, but every time he said the word protocols, the woman with the bright headscarf would pop into his head. He tried to suppress the image, but it would come back. Her hard gaze, her quiet but determined voice. He felt something cold run down his spine. But the most unexpected thing happened on board the plane. One of the flight attendants, returning from the back cabin, looked worried. She approached the captain and whispered, "Captain, we have a problem. The passengers are starting to ask questions. They want an explanation for what happened to that woman. They say it was wrong." "What?" the captain asked irritably, not hiding his irritation. "Tell them to calm down. We have instructions, and they have no right to interface. But they say," the stewardess hesitated, her voice becoming quieter, "they say that if we don't apologize publicly, they'll start a mutiny on board." The captain turned pale. His gaze darted to the instrument panel, and then to the speakers through which he could address all the passengers. "Rebellion," he whispered, as if to himself. "They can't. It's ridiculous." Meanwhile, in the cabin, things were indeed becoming increasingly chaotic. People were discussing, whispering, some even approaching the stewards with direct demands. "Why did that woman leave and is still here?" asked the girl in the sweatshirt, the one who had raised her voice first. "Why can't anyone tell us what happened? We have a right to know." The man sitting next to her, 10 years older than her, nodded. "It's not fair. She did nothing wrong, and she was kicked out. This pilot must answer for his actions." The tension grew with each passing minute. The passengers, who at first had simply wanted to forget about what had happened, now united in a common feeling of indignation. But the most unexpected thing was something else. Among them was a woman who did not belong to any of these rows. Her face seemed unfamiliar. Her clothes were unremarkable, but her gaze spoke volumes. She quietly rose and approached the man sitting closest to the cockpit. "Will you help me?" she asked, her voice quiet but firm. The man nodded. Without asking questions, she pulled something out of her pocket that no one expected to see. It was a key that could change everything. The woman with the key stood in the aisle of the car, her figure seeming to absorb all the darkness of the situation. Her eyes, sharp as blades, scanned those around her, while the passengers whispered, not understanding what was happening. The man who had agreed to help her Saturday next to her, his hands clasped tensely, as if he sensed that something was about to happen that would turn everything upside down. The plane, despite its forward motion, seemed to be hanging in a dead center. The atmosphere was tense to the limit, the air thick and suffocating. The woman approached the door that led to the service compartment and inserted the key into the keyhole. The soft click sounded like thunder in a silent cabin. Someone screamed, and the stewardess, noticing her actions, rushed toward her. "What are you doing? Stop right now," she screamed, her voice full of panic. But the woman turned around, her face expressing cold calm. "I'm not going to hurt anyone," she said, "but what happened today wasn't a mistake. It was a pattern. I'm just going to show everyone how deep this problem goes." The passengers looked at her, some with horror, some with interest, and then the door opened. It was disguised as an ordinary compartment for technical equipment, but inside, behind a thin partition, there was a small room. No one knew what exactly was there. People began to get up from their seats, to come closer, but the woman blocked their way. "Look, but don't come here," she said. "What you see will change your understanding of how this world works." Inside the room, on the walls, were photographs, black and white, blurry, like forgotten ghosts of the past. Each of the pictures showed passengers sitting on airplanes, but they all had one thing in common. They were black, and they all had the same look in their eyes, a look of horror and despair. People started talking. Someone shouted, "What is this place? Why does it exist?" The woman pointed to one of the photographs. It showed a family, a mother, father, and a small boy. Their faces were filled with confusion. At the bottom of the photograph was the caption, "Flight 1437, removed at the request of other passengers." "This isn't just an archive," the woman said, her voice a thunderous warning. "This is proof. These people are real. They were removed from flights only because their existence was embarrassing to someone. This is their system." The crowd began to make noise. Some passengers demanded explanations. Some tried to deny what they had seen. But in the eyes of most, awareness was appearing. No one wanted to look at this truth, but it stood before them, huge and cold, like a mountain. At this point, the pilot, hearing the noise, left his seat in the cockpit and went into the cabin. His face turned crimson when he saw that the woman had opened the secret compartment. "What are you doing?" he yelled, his voice breaking into a hoarse voice. "Close this immediately. You have no right." The woman turned to face him, her gaze firm. "Right?" she asked. "What right did you have to kick me off the flight? What right do you have to decide who can fly and who can't?" This is a lie," the pilot shouted. "These photos are fake. They are just old recordings, nothing more." But his words did not convince anyone. One of the passengers, a middle-aged man, shouted, "If it's a lie, why are you so scared? Why does this room even exist?" The crowd began to move towards the pilot. His face turned gray. He backed away, but the people who had been silent until recently were now demanding an explanation. The stewards tried to calm the passengers, but this only fueled their anger. "Did you think you could keep this up forever?" the woman with the key continued, her voice growing louder. "You built a system that excluded us, that made us feel second to class, but now you will be seen for who you are." At this point, the plane began to shake, but no one paid attention to it. The pilot tried to return to the cockpit, but the passengers blocked his way. He had nowhere to go. He was cornered. "It wasn't my idea," he shouted, trying to justify himself. "It's all the corporation. They're making us do this. We have no choice." But his words sounded like a feeble attempt to deflect blame. No one believed him. The atmosphere in the cabin grew tense, as if the plane itself were reflecting the anger of the people inside. The woman with the key stepped forward and raised her hand, calling for silence. "Do you hear me?" she asked. "He says it's not his fault. But then who is to blame? All of us. Everyone who kept quiet when they saw injustice. Everyone who looked away when we were thrown out. Humiliated, ignored. But now there will be no more silence." Her words echoed through the cabin. The plane tilted, but no one moved. It was the moment of truth. The moment when everyone had to decide whether they would be part of the system or begin to destroy it. The plane shook violently, and the lights in the cabin flickered. The people frowned, their indignation replaced by primal fear. The pilot seemed ready to lose the last of his composure. He grabbed the nearest bulkhead, trying to keep his balance, but his voice trembled betrayingly when he spoke. "You're all going crazy," he shouted, trying to be heard over the growing noise. "We have to work together to get this flight out safely. You don't know what you're doing." But his words sounded like a drowning man's feeble attempt to grasp at a straw. People looked at him with contempt, and this contempt grew with each passing moment. The woman with the key, standing in the epicenter of this storm, raised her hand, demanding silence. "Work together." Her voice cut through the noise like a knife. "You mean cooperation? After years of dividing us into the worthy and the unwanted, after your cooperation has been to suppress and humiliate those who look different." She took a step forward, her figure seeming monolithic despite the shaking plane. "You don't understand," she continued. "To you, this is just another day at work, just another shift. But to us, this is our life. You decided that our pain was trivial, that our existence could be ignored. But now you'll look us in the eye." The pilot looked as if he wanted to disappear. His face turned red, then pale, and he suddenly began making excuses, hastily and incoherently. "I didn't come up with this. I was just following directions," he shouted. "Do you think I like this? Do you think I wanted this to happen?" "Yes," the woman answered coldly. "You wanted to, because it was convenient for you, because you knew no one would dare to oppose you." The crowd around her began to roar, some cheering her on, others silent, but with recognition in their eyes. The plane shook again, and the lights went out for a few seconds, leaving the passengers in a frightening darkness. When the lights came back, the expressions on people's faces changed. It was more than anger. It was the realization that they were part of something much bigger than themselves. The woman stepped toward one of the screens built into the bulkhead. She knew what she was doing, knew that this was what would change everything. She pressed a few buttons, and the same photograph from the hidden compartment lit up screens all over the cabin. Faces of passengers humiliated, removed, ignored. Their eyes stared straight at those now sitting in their seats. "Look at them," she said, her voice calm but every note vibrating with anger. "These aren't just photographs. These are lives. This is the fear they felt because of people like you, because of the silence, because of the indifference." The passengers began to whisper. Many turned away, as if they could not bear the gaze of these faces. But it was too late. They had seen, and what they had seen was impossible to forget. At this time, the plane banked again, and the cries of the second pilot were heard from the cockpit. "We're having technical problems," He shouted, "We're losing control." The pilot rushed back into the cockpit, as if hoping that if he saved the plane, he would also save himself from this endless trial unfolding behind him. But the woman stood there, her voice louder than the alarms. "Do you think this is just an accident?" she asked. "Do you think you can ignore us forever? The world always punishes those who build their power on the pain of others." Her words were like a prophecy. The plane shook again, and many passengers screamed, but she did not flinch. Her gaze was fixed on the screens, where the faces of the victims continued to stare straight into the souls of anyone who dared to meet their eyes. The pilot, sitting in the cockpit, tried to stabilize the plane, but his hands were shaking. He felt as if the air was being compressed around him. His mind was torn between despair and fear. He seemed to hear her voice, even through the closed doors. "No one can run from what they've done." It sounded like a spell in his head, and no one can hide from the truth. The plane began to level out, but it brought no peace to any of the passengers. They knew that after landing, their lives would never be the same. And the woman with the key stood in the center of the cabin, a reminder that silence is not neutrality, but a weapon that hurts everyone. After several agonizing minutes of panic, the plane leveled out, its roar becoming steady and predictable. The passengers fell into a tense silence once more, as if they realized that their actions today had changed everything around them. But no one felt relief. The air in the cabin was filled with anxiety and a sense of inevitable retribution. In the cockpit, the pilot sat with his hands clasped, staring at the instrument panel as if it could give him answers. His face was pale, and beads of sweat were running down his temples. The co-pilot glanced at him furtively. "Are you okay?" he asked carefully. "Okay," the pilot echoed, his voice shaking. "How can you be okay when the whole world is falling apart? Did you see what they did? They turned everyone against me. They made me look like a monster." The co-pilot hesitated, but did not answer. He knew that further conversation could only make the situation worse. The pilot, however, did not wait for an answer and again stared at the instruments, but saw nothing but his own reflection in the glass. He remembered the woman, her calm, firm voice, and the look that pierced him. He never thought that these moments, ordinary decisions, as it seemed to him then, would come back to haunt him. The faces of the passengers, the airline had kicked off their flights, were still visible on the monitors in the cabin. The images were an invisible indictment, each one seeming to weigh heavily on the pilot's shoulders. He tried to convince himself that he had done everything right, that he had followed protocol, but something inside him had broken. "I was just doing my job," he whispered, as if trying to justify himself. But other moments began to surface in his memory, similar episodes that he had been trying to suppress. The woman with the small child he had forced off the flight because of an uncomfortable ad. The young man who had been thrown out after a suspicious look from a fellow passenger. All these faces began to surface in his mind, turning his thoughts into a foggy nightmare. And then the thing he feared most happened. He was handed a message that came straight from the airline's headquarters. The pilot slowly opened the tablet, his fingers shaking. The message was short but deadly. "The media has picked up the story. Protests outside our offices are intensifying. Your name is in every headline. We are forced to launch an internal investigation. Until all the circumstances are clarified, you are suspended from work. When you return, hand over your documents and keys." He stared at the screen, disbelieving his eyes. His career, which he had built over decades, was crumbling before his eyes. He felt the ground slipping out from under his feet. But that was only the first blow. A few minutes later, a flight attendant burst into his cabin. She looked scared, but her face expressed not only fear, but also despair. "Captain," she began, not looking him in the eye, "you must know, she's not just a passenger. That woman, her face is all over the internet now. She's being called the face of a new movement. People are demanding your resignation. They're demanding justice. And her words are becoming a manifesto." The pilot felt a weight building in his chest. He saw her again in his mind's eye, calm but unyielding, standing in the aisle with the key in her hand. She was more than just a passenger. She was a force he could not stop. He realized that he had now become a symbol of what millions hated. And then he remembered one more thing. Her last phrase, spoken with cold confidence. "No one will escape the answer. Not even you." Suddenly he found it hard to breathe. He felt his own shadow falling over him. The plane, the noise, the passengers, everything was gone. All that was left was the feeling, that the truth he had been trying to escape had caught up with him. Meanwhile, in the cabin, the woman Saturday, her face calm but her eyes determined. The passengers around her began to mutter, but no longer with judgment, but with support. She was not alone, and that was important, for too long her voice, like the others, had been drowned out. But now it was louder than ever, and the pilot knew it. As the plane began its descent, the world around the pilot seemed to become unbearably small with each passing minute. His confidence was fading, giving way to panic that was growing inside him like a black hole. His hands, clenched on the control stick, were covered in cold sweat, and he felt his consciousness shrinking under the weight of his own thoughts. A low hum sounded in his ears, not from the engine, but from his own pulse, which was beating so loudly that it seemed to echo in the walls of the cabin. "They're looking at me," he whispered, more to himself than to the co-pilot. "Who?" asked the co-pilot, casting an anxious glance at him. "Everyone," the captain said, his eyes wandering over the instruments as if they might provide answers. "These passengers, this woman, the people on the ground, they know who I am. They see me." The co-pilot frowned, but said nothing. He could only watch the controls as the captain was clearly losing his grip. But he was no longer aware of his surroundings. His mind was consumed by a growing terror that he could no longer ignore. He suddenly remembered his first flight. He had been young then, full of confidence. It seemed to him that in there he was a king above all problems, above earthly concerns. But now, decades later, for the first time he felt that he was not in control of himself, not in control of the situation. Everything he had considered immutable, his authority, his status, his power, was crumbling like sand under his feet. And then the woman's face came into his mind. It seemed to come alive before him, her eyes looking straight into his soul, cold and penetrating. Her words echoed in his head. "No one will escape the answer, not even you." The words sounded like a curse. He felt his throat tighten, as if an invisible hand was choking him from the inside. He found it hard to breathe. His fingers loosened, and he almost dropped the control stick. The co-pilot immediately took over, his voice sharp. "You're not okay. What's going on?" But the captain did not answer. His gaze was fixed on the control panel, although he could not see anything there. Before his eyes were images of the people he had thrown off flights, their faces full of humiliation. They looked at him with silent reproach, and it was impossible to hide from those looks. "You were just following the rules," he tried to convince himself, but the words rang hollow now. He realized that the rules were just a convenient mask he hid behind. The rules allowed him not to ask questions, not to think about how others felt. But now the mask was off. At this moment, the voice of the woman, the one with the key, cut through the silence of the cabin through the loudspeaker. "You think you've won, Captain." Her voice was calm, but every syllable seemed to penetrate the deepest recesses of his mind. "You thought your power would protect you, but power vanishes when used against the innocent. You have no control now. Cut the comms," the pilot shouted, his voice full of panic. The co-pilot quickly complied, but the captain knew it wouldn't help. Her words had already penetrated him. Meanwhile, the plane began to descend. The passengers in the cabin were more attentive than ever. No one argued, no one complained. Their silence spoke louder than any words. They knew they were part of something bigger than an ordinary flight. They were witnessing the destruction of the old order. As the plane approached the ground, the pilot suddenly felt a fear that he could no longer control. He realized his vulnerability. He realized that he was just a man, not a god, not a king, but a cog in a system that was falling apart right before his eyes. "What will happen when we land?" he whispered to himself. But he already knew the answer. His career was ruined. His name had become a symbol of everything millions hated on the ground. It wasn't applause that awaited him, but cameras, questions, and the court of public opinion. And he knew he couldn't justify himself. His face darkened. He saw the woman's face again, her firm gaze, her fearlessness, her determination to speak out, her words, like a knife, cutting through his last vestiges of confidence. "The system you built will no longer protect you. Your mistakes have caught up with you. Now you are just a man, as vulnerable as those you ignored." The plane landed, and with that impact of the landing gear on the ground, the captain felt his whole world collapse. When the plane stopped, there was a moment of absolute silence. It seemed as if the whole world had stopped, holding its breath. But then the cabin began to move, People were getting up from their seats, slowly taking out their luggage, exchanging glances. But this was not the usual chaos of landing. This was something else. Everyone knew that there was more to come than just getting off the plane. The captain remained in the cockpit. He could hear the noise in the cabin, but he did not dare leave his seat. His hands were shaking, and his breathing was becoming increasingly heavy. He knew that there was something waiting for him on the ground that he could not escape. He tried to imagine what would happen next, but each scenario was darker than the last. "You have to get out," the co-pilot said quietly, breaking the tense silence. "I can't," the captain replied, his voice weak. "They're waiting for me. They want to see me fall. Maybe it's necessary." The second pilot snapped. His words were cold but true. "You ruined everything yourself. Now you have to answer for it." At that moment there was a knock on the cockpit door. The pilot flinched as if he had been electrocuted. The voice of the flight attendant was behind the door. "Captain, you need to get out. There are representatives of the airline and the press here. They are waiting for you." He wanted to say no. He wanted to hide, but he knew it was impossible. Gathering up the last of his courage, he slowly stood up, his steps hesitant. He opened the door and saw that the entire cabin was looking at him. The passengers' gazes were heavy, a mixture of condemnation, disappointment, and something else, but none of them were looks of sympathy. As he stepped into the passage, his heart sank. The woman, the one with the key, stood at the exit. Her face was calm, but her gaze was piercing. "Did you think the truth would never catch up with you?" she asked as he approached. He didn't answer. Her words hung in the air like a sentence. He knew she was right. They were already waiting for him at the plane steps. The crowd of protesters erupted in shouts as he appeared. Banners reading "Justice" and "No to Racism" filled the space, and reporters' cameras flashed, blinding him. He felt the circle tighten around him. His steps slowed until he stopped altogether, unable to move any further. But the woman with the key was not among the shouting. She stood to the side, watching. Her presence spoke louder than any shouting from the crowd. "You have to understand," she said later, when they met face to face, away from the cameras. "This isn't just about you. This is about the system you represented. Your downfall is the beginning of something bigger." He couldn't look her in the eye. A mixture of shame and anger boiled inside him, but he couldn't express either. All he could do was look away. After the public scrutiny and dismissal, the pilot found himself isolated. He was forbidden to comment on the incident and lost his job. Online platforms were filled with discussions of his actions, and each mention felt like another blow to his existence. He tried to find solace in solitude, but the silence was unbearable. It brought with it the faces of those he had once humiliated and words he could no longer ignore. Meanwhile, the woman with the key, whose name was now known to millions, continued to speak. Her words were heard at rallies, on the news, on social networks. She became a symbol of change, a voice for those who had previously been ignored. But she did not speak with hatred. Her words were about justice, about hope, about a world where no one would feel out of place. The pilot turned on the TV one day and saw her performing. She stood on stage in front of a huge crowd, her voice firm but kind. "This isn't about revenge," she said. "This is about the truth. This is about no one being afraid to be themselves anymore. We have to create a world where everyone is worthy of respect. Even those who have made mistakes can change. But to do that, you have to acknowledge your mistakes and accept the truth." Her words cut through him. For the first time in a long time, he felt the fear fading, giving way to something else. It was a weight, but not an empty weight. It was the weight of awareness. He realized that his isolation was not a punishment. It was an opportunity to look at himself and who he was. He didn't know what would happen next, but he understood the main thing. Now he had a chance to become better, and this was the beginning of his redemption. Friends, this story was created to make us think about the importance of equality, justice, and respect for each person. We would like to know your opinion. What do you think about this story? Have you ever experienced injustice or racism in your life? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments. Your words are very important to us, and we sincerely appreciate each of you. If you enjoyed this story or it made you think, don't forget to subscribe, like, and support us. We'd love to see you again. We wish you a wonderful day, full of kindness and understanding. Remember that each of us can make the world a better place.